Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone who has joined our webinar here today. We're going to go ahead and begin. My name is Eric Marshall. I serve as the Executive Director of PDG, the Partnership for DSCSA Governance. And I just want to welcome everyone and thank you for taking the time to join us for today's session. We are holding today's session on an ordinary Zoom line to facilitate Q&A dialogue at the end of the presentation. And so just a couple of housekeeping matters to begin. First, please do stay on mute and off camera if possible through the presentation portion. Once we get to the Q&A session, we'll welcome you coming off of mute and asking any questions that you have. But in the interim, please do stay on mute and off camera. For a better view, I'd encourage you to use the speaker view setting just to get a better view of the presentation as we go through this portion of the session. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted along with the slides from today's presentation on the PDG website and made available. So if you have any questions in that regard to the slides, we will make those available. And again, this will be recorded and made available on the PDG website, www.dscsagovernance.org. As I mentioned, we'll also have an opportunity for questions and answers later in the program. As you go through the conversation, you're welcome to use the chat feature to submit any questions that you may have. We will hold those questions for the end, but do please feel free to put those questions in the chat at any point through the presentation, and we will tee those up for conversation at the end. Today's session is the first of a 5-part series. Today, we will really focus on just providing a little bit of background for those of you who aren't familiar on PDG and our public-private partnership with the FDA, how we think about interoperability, the role of our PDG blueprint in supporting interoperability, and then do a quick preview of some of those new chapters of the PDG blueprint that have been rolled out this month. The future webinars, as you can see on the list here, will start to dig deeper into each of those new chapters and various topics of the blueprint in more depth. One thing just to note here, if you've registered for today's webinar, you do need to register separately for each of these 5 sessions on the PDG website. So if you've not done so and you would like to join the others, please do go ahead and register for those on the PDG website.
Eric, excuse me. If you're sharing your screen, we're not, or at least I'm not seeing anything.
Thank you for flagging that, Pam. I had my screen paused and I appreciate that. Thanks, Pam. So now you should see the series of 5-part webinars that will be coming up over the coming weeks. And again, if you've not registered for the additional 4 sessions and would like to join, please do register for those on the PDG website. And also just note again that those will be recorded and made available after they're held as well. Today, I'm joined by a few panelists who are going to be part of our conversation today. First, as many of you know, Connie Jung, Senior Advisor for Policy in FDA's Office of Drug Security, Integrity, and Response. Second, Matt Price, who's affiliated and represents Medline Industries within PDG. Matt also serves as the chair of our PDG Board of Directors, and along with Brian, serves as the co-chair of our Interoperability Committee. And last but not least, Brian Lee from Bristol Myers Squibb. Brian is one of our original PDG board members and currently serves along with Matt, as I mentioned, as the co-chair of our Interoperability Committee. So thank you to each of our panelists who will be part of the conversation here today. For those of you that are not familiar with PDG, PDG is a collaborative forum and an FDA public-private partnership really focused on building and sustaining an effective and efficient model or vision for interoperable tracing and verification under the DSCSA. Several years ago, many in industry recognized that we needed to have a forum where industry could come together to cast that common shared vision for interoperability, recognizing that having 50 different approaches to 2023 DSCSA implementation just wasn't consistent with the notion of interoperability, that we needed to start to narrow that scope and provide that roadmap or blueprint, as we call it, to get to interoperability in 2023. And so the organization was stood up in 2018 and kicked off its work putting together that blueprint. Ultimately, the power of PDG really is in its members. So you can see the list of our more than 60 members who are part of PDG and active participants in the work that we do. This is a very membership-driven organization. All of these members are very involved in the dialogue and discussion that goes into developing the requirements and recommendations that you'll see laid out in the blueprint. And we're grateful for their participation and contribution. And really, it's that strength and diversity of the members that make PDG unique, representing all of those various sectors, all types of manufacturers, wholesalers, dispensers, and one of the few forums where those trading partners also interact and participate directly with the solution providers and technical experts in this space as well. And ultimately, the culmination of all of that work is our blueprint document. And so I will turn over to Matt Price here in a second to just share a little bit more of kind of the general background about our PDG blueprint and what it is and how it's come to be and why it's an important document in helping us all kind of think about interoperability. Ultimately, that is a 6-chapter document. First chapter came out in 2021, and earlier this month we published 4 additional chapters. I will note that our 6th and final chapter is very near publication, and we expect that to be published soon. So you'll see reference throughout here to chapter 6, and we're so confident that it's about to come out that we even have the webinar for it scheduled. So while you may go peek around on our website and see 5 chapters, ultimately this will be a 6-chapter document with that 6th chapter around credentialing that we expect to come out soon. And so with that, Matt, I will turn to you to just share a little bit more about the blueprint and how that came to be.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. And thank you all for joining. As Eric mentioned, or you probably gathered, tremendous amount of work has gone into the creation and release of this document. So we're excited to share it with you. And if you haven't already, encourage you to dive into it and to start understanding it. But as Eric mentioned, this is a culmination of many years of work. In 2021, that initial chapter was established and published, which contains the compliance and business requirements for 2023 interoperability. We affectionately refer to it as the what of 2023 interoperability. And then earlier this month, as Eric also mentioned, we released 4 additional chapters, or the how to functionally satisfy those requirements that were defined in chapter 1. And really in such a way that pulls together the components of 2023 interoperability in such a vast supply chain, different types of entities and sizes of organizations and whatnot. How do we effectively pull all those together so that we can collectively meet the requirements of DSCSA? And recognizing the technical nature of these chapters, many in the industry are relying upon more technically focused solution providers, or as an example. We have also, as you'll see on this slide, we have come up with these summary fact sheets, which essentially summarize in lay terms what the elements or the ingredients of each of those subsequent chapters contain. Think of it like an executive summary that boils down those key points in the event. That's where you at least want to start to try to understand these things. And as you'll note too, at the top of this slide, all of these documents are available on our website, the PDG website, dscsagovernance.org/blueprint. And so we invite you to pull those down if you haven't already. All right, if we go to the next slide, please. Now, this slide takes me back to college calculus. For any of those of you who have been through college calculus, there are 2 key parts to getting the answer right. Number 1, getting the answer right. Number 2, showing how you got the answer right. And that's really what we want to help all to understand, especially those who have not been part of these discussions in DSCSA, that it's not just the blueprint, but it's the process that we followed in order to create and publish the blueprint. This process involved more than 275 work group sessions, various work groups on various topics that pulled folks together from throughout the industry to come up with a way or the way to satisfy interoperability in 2023. This was an aggregate of more than 10,000 hours of time that these ones spent to pull this together. And notably, participation and input came from all of the sectors of the supply chain: manufacturers, wholesale distributors, dispensers, 3PLs, repackagers, various types of entities within each of those sectors. And also important contributions came from the solution providers and FDA themselves as they participated in some of these discussions. And then when all of that came together, those extensive discussions led to work group consensus. That is, those within those work groups agreeing upon the solutions and then submitting them to the interoperability committee, which is the layer above all of the work groups. That interoperability committee then pulled together all the other members of PDG who were not part of that work group to go through and reach consensus on that as well. But that's not where it ended. It then went to general membership approval to ensure that there was not only sector neutrality, but there was broad agreement by all of the members of PDG for us to reach this. And that's where that last box really comes in. It required two parts, it being the blueprint and these subsequent chapters, in order to be approved and published. Number one, supermajority of the general members. It required at least 66% of all voting members in order to pass. But it also didn't stop there. There was a majority within each sector that would be required, because by nature, some sectors like wholesale distributors are smaller by number than the number of manufacturers and dispensers. And so that helped to achieve that sector neutrality and listening to the voice of each of those sectors. The result, hopefully you'll find that you can have great confidence in all of the work that went into creating this document and all of these chapters, and give you confidence that when interacting with authorized trading partners and solution providers in the future, if they adhere to the PDG blueprint, it will effectively support interoperability and all of our ability to comply with the requirements of DSCSA. Next slide, please. Now, through the blueprint, we did not draw up or create a car, as you might think by this slide. This slide is actually an analogy that has been kicked around the walls of PDG, and that's of development of a vehicle, design of a vehicle, especially the electrical vehicle movement. When all of those entities started creating electrical vehicles, they didn't start from scratch. They pulled a lot of the information that had already been come up with, had been designed and identified as best practice from gas-powered vehicles. And so in similar ways, this is what PDG has done. Where good designs already existed in the pieces that make up interoperability, we sought to incorporate them. Pun intended, we did not try to recreate the wheel. We incorporated those. However, if and where there were components that were missing, that were unaddressed or newly needed, that's where we, as part of these work groups and the process that they followed, sought to step in to define those things. First, we pulled together pieces of work that were done to bring into this comprehensive framework. There has been a lot of great work done by a lot of great groups, and we sought to pull those together. Entities like GS1 US, like HDA, like OCI, and others. We sought to identify those, pull them in, and for the first time, bring them all together in the grand frame of DSCSA. And then second, as we mentioned, we sought to identify and to fill those gaps. For example, defining a method for tracing that hadn't been done before. And so as part of the blueprint, the tracing chapter, chapter 5, you likely have noticed if you haven't, or if you've looked already, that we developed a tracing information request and response protocol with the intent of filling that void. Next slide, please. And that brings us to the chapters of the blueprint itself, how they really were intended to build on each other to create the overarching vision for interoperability. Chapter 1, as noted here, published in 2021, it was, as mentioned, intended to establish or to lay the foundation of 2023 interoperability, defining the business requirements and the compliance requirements that really make up that foundation. Chapter 2, the overarching description of functional design for interoperability. Before we got into these technical chapters, it was felt that we needed a chapter to kind of lay some groundwork for understanding of concepts and terms that would be used as we got into those additional chapters. And then that brought us to the next one, chapter 3, TITS, so transaction information, transaction statement, exchange, those things that must go along with all of those electronic communications when transacting product as part of DSCSA. And then we get into another one, which Eric mentioned is on the verge of being able to be published, which is chapter 6, credentialing and user authentication functional design. This was really intended to define options for approaches organizations could take to do two key things: to know who they're working with or transacting with, and if those entities are duly authorized according to the statute. Are they duly licensed or registered like they are supposed to be? And so that's what that chapter really was, to establish a process, not an exact technology per se, but the process that could be used, be that manual in nature or more automated. And there's an example of that included in that chapter. And then finally, chapters 4 and 5, these were the functional designs for the processes of verification and tracing, and then incorporating those credentialing concepts. In doing so, understanding that in a lot of cases, verification and tracing are likely to be transactions or interactions that are done between trading partners that may not have direct relationships. And so that really is the structure for these chapters, and we'll be discussing them a little bit more as we go through this webinar and then future webinars to come. And as you go through this, we also wanted to just make everyone aware of the change control or change request process. We realize this is going to be a living document, especially when you consider how much and how frequent technologies that change and lessons are learned throughout the industry. And so as they relate to the blueprint, this is a mechanism that can be used to request changes for consideration. And then if they are agreed upon and approved by the general members, could then be implemented as part of the blueprint. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Eric Marshall. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for all that background and kind of all the process that went into the blueprint. And a critical piece of that, as you mentioned, was our ability to work collaboratively with FDA under our public-private partnership. And so I want to invite Connie Jung from FDA to kind of step in and share a little bit more about that PPP. Obviously, we valued it from your side, but love to hear more about it from your side and share a little bit more about interoperability.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Eric and Matt and Brian and PDG for inviting FDA to participate in the webinar series. And Matt, I always love seeing your hearing about your analogies and your pictures. So thanks for that. It always makes me kind of smile and laugh. So yeah, I want if we could advance the slide, or at least I'm not seeing the next slide. There you go. So if you're not familiar with public-private partnerships, FDA uses these to support activities to advance regulatory science. And these efforts encourage the development of new tools to facilitate innovation in the areas of medical product development and other areas. And they provide a mechanism for convening multiple stakeholders and organizations such that, resources and expertise and even partnering can be brought together to tackle gaps or needs beyond the capacity of one single organization. And FDA's involvement can help bring the focus of the public-private partnership to focus it on addressing regulatory needs. And the products that are produced through these partnerships are shared in the public domain, as you see PDG doing with this the blueprint for wider uptake, and that's for input and also use. So the DSCSA public-private partnership was established in July in 2020 between FDA and the Partnership for DSCSA Governance, or PDG. And as Eric mentioned earlier, we heard from industry that there was a need for a governance body with some to be able to assist stakeholders in figuring out the complexities of the legal requirements and the technical needs. And we're so glad that PDG was established and stepped up to fill this role. PDG supports the effective and efficient implementation of DSCSA requirements for electronic interoperable tracing and verification of the prescription drugs that are distributed in the United States. And through the public-private partnership, FDA is able to be engaged and part of this very important work. Next slide, please. As we are all focusing on DSCSA implementation, and we have come such a long way since 2013, we have lot-level product tracing and verification in place, and we now have serialized product out in the supply chain. The enhanced drug distribution security requirements that are in Section 582G1 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act will go into effect in November 27, 2023. And these requirements focus on electronic data exchange and utilization of that product identifier, particularly the serialized information. Supply chain stakeholders, many of you have been working hard to implement the enhanced security requirements, and we understand that this is not an easy task. Interoperability is a key concept as members of the supply chains are communicating and exchanging data. And this information should be done in an accurate, efficient, and consistent manner. Any methods used to standardize the data and the business processes will facilitate interoperability. So FDA has issued several guidances for industry to help clarify these concepts. And so I'll refer you to check out our DSCSA webpage for finalization of these guidances and other updates as we continue with DSCSA implementation. And of course, this webinar series that focuses on PDG's blueprint for 2023 interoperability. This is a great resource for trading partners and other stakeholders for how to operationalize those DSCSA requirements for now and in the future. So with that, I'll turn it back over to PDG.
Thanks, Connie. Thank you for your partnership over the last several years and for those comments and for being here today. Connie, you mentioned kind of the high level of what those requirements are, and those are well defined out there in Section 582G, as you note. Often as I think about those requirements, I always kind of come back to two really big shifts that they drive in the operational implementation. And you'll see that in a lot of ways, what's in the PDG blueprint really builds off of and tries to address and respond to those two big shifts. The first is just the volume and granularity of data and the change in that will come in November of 2023, later this year. Today, as Connie said, right, we are tracking at the lot level. We have lot level traceability through TI and TH exchange. And today, right, that means several 100,000 different batches, lots of product throughout the supply chain produced by manufacturers that are now tracked through the supply chain by TI and TH. Several 100,000 seems a lot, but the big shift that comes, right, one of the big shifts that comes in November is that transition to unit level traceability. So away from the lot, right, the notion that the manufacturer made 30,000 packages in a lot, down to individual traceability of that individual package or unit of product. And so we're going to go from tracking several 100,000 lots, which seems like a lot, to now trying to trace 4.5 roughly billion units through the supply chain. So 4.5 billion units traced by each by their own individual set of transaction information, or TI. Of course, each of those products is not usually sold only once, right? On average, you're looking at probably about 2 transactions per product, often sold by a manufacturer to a wholesaler, and then again by a wholesaler or pharmacy. Obviously, a lot of different variations in what those chains can look like, but on average, roughly 2 transactions per unit. And so you're talking about not only now 4.5 billion units of TI that are exchanged, but 8 to 10 billion individual transactions per year through the supply chain under the DSCSA. And ultimately, right, those TI are both an outbound by the seller, an outbound TI, and then it has to be received, captured, and maintained inbound by the purchasing trading partner. And so while sometimes that may be, through a portal, its own, kind of own reference, you're now talking about 16 to 20 billion instances of TI as you think about both sides of that transaction. So we've gone from tracking a few 100,000 lots by TI and TH to now talking about 16 to 20 billion instances of TI per year throughout the supply chain. And oh, by the way, right, you've got to maintain that, store and maintain those records for 6 years under the DSCSA. So we're now talking about, in that steady state, somewhere in that ballpark, again, these are all rough numbers, but somewhere in that ballpark of 100 billion different instances of TI that we start to move toward in 2023. That's about a 10 to 20,000x increase in those instances of TI and that level and granularity. For those of you that like me have trouble getting your head around that, what's hundreds of thousands versus millions, hundreds of millions, billions, what is that? That's what this looks like. If your screen is big enough, you may see a tiny little red speck up in that left-hand corner. That's essentially the level of granularity and amount of information that's being managed on the lot level. Moving to that unit level in 2023, right, that all of those little green boxes now represent the level of granularity come 2023. Again, this is a visualization and a generalization. This is not necessarily one for one, megabytes out there being stored or anything like that. But conceptually, we are moving from tracking several 100,000 lots to a level of granularity and volume of data that is incredibly complex. And right now you take all of those 100 billion different instances of TI and they're spread out across tens of thousands of trading partners throughout the supply chain in a distributed model. And then along comes something like tracing under the DSCSA. And in many ways what that DSCSA tracing requirement says, go find the 4 individual records out of that 100 billion spread across the country and across trading partners and pull them as part of an investigation to support your investigation, right? That tracing process, for example, really becomes a true needle in a haystack kind of exercise. And so that level of granularity and volume of data is one of the major shifts that comes in 2023 and part of what we've tried to be responsive to in our blueprint. Second is just the interaction of trading partners and indirect trading partners in 2023. So today, almost all at the electronic interaction level, almost all of that interaction is happening today between 2 trading partners who have an established, well-documented, well-understood commercial relationship. Somebody who's buying or selling product from each other has a well-established commercial relationship, having electronic interactions to exchange and facilitate the exchange of information at that lot level. Come 2023, the notion is introduced of kind of what we've called indirect interactions, where a third entity may start to need to have an electronic interaction, interoperable electronic interaction to verify a product or to trace a product with a party that they do not have that established commercial relationship with. So if you think about, tiny little independent pharmacy in Minot, North Dakota, now needing to interact with, Brian over at BMS, and they don't have an established commercial relationship, they don't really know each other because they've always exchanged product through a wholesaler in the middle who holds those commercial relationships. You start to introduce that possibility that small little pharmacy out in Minot may come to Brian and say, I need you to verify a product or trace a product. And so how do you create the electronic interoperability for them to be able to do so? And then as we talk about that credentialing process, how do you know who that is on the other end of that transaction if it's outside of that context of that trusted commercial relationship? So building on kind of Connie's point, just want to highlight there again, those two really big shifts that come in 2023, among others, but two really big shifts that come in 2023 with that level of granularity of the data in the introduction of that notion of electronic interactions between indirect trading partners. And you'll see as Brian starts to go in a minute here kind of through some more detail around what our various chapters of the blueprint is and how we put requirements and recommendations around that, how we try to build on and address those two big components. Last thing I'll say before turning to Brian is just kind of that high level snapshot, and Brian will speak more to this concept a little bit too, of how we as PDG kind of think about interoperability when you think about the tens of thousands of trading partners that are out there in that kind of an environment. What you see here, again, just diagrammed out here, a number of trading partners, right? Obviously, this is a snapshot of them, a lot of trading partners out there. But ultimately, most of those trading partners are relying on either a third-party solution or their own developed solution. The way interoperability is established is through a technology or a solution. And so distinguishing kind of between that trading partner layer that you see down at the bottom, A, B, C, up through P, versus those solutions that they're using to meet those requirements. And ultimately, our emphasis and focus has really been at that solution layer. Again, that may be a third-party solution, or it may be your own in-house kind of homegrown solution, or somewhere in the middle where it's a configured, customized solution for your organization. But creating that level of interoperability at that solution level. And ultimately, that's what we've talked about, kind of this environment as our PDG defined EDDS, Enhanced Drug Distribution Security Network, to meet 2023. One of the things that's kind of embedded in that notion is that it is a PDG defined network. It is not a PDG operated network. And there are organizations that may be outside of that network, and that is fine. You see some organizations to the left there. There's a notion in the DSCSA about alternate methods of compliance, right, that allow somebody to take their own approach. And so we fully recognize that not everyone is going to follow what's laid out in the PDG blueprint, but we've tried to cast that net wide. But also, as you think about the blueprint at that trading partner level, for those of you on the call who may not be as familiar with the blueprint, having some general familiarity with the blueprint, I think, is important, but just as important as the content itself, because it is a long technical document, as Matt Price pointed out, right, is understanding the process that went into it and why it's a strong, robust document. Versus really the level of understanding that we hope solution providers will have, really having that detailed understanding and ability to integrate and implement that blueprint at a more technical level. So again, just wanted to share that as a little bit of kind of how we think about interoperability in that kind of an environment or ecosystem. And so again, Brian Lee from BMS will pick it up and probably go into a little bit more detail around that. But I'm going to kick it over to Brian to kind of walk us through, again, as Matt Price had laid out, those various components of the blueprint. Again, we'll do more detailed webinars on each of these various chapters over the coming weeks. And so we just want to give people a little bit of an intro to what you'll see in those various chapters in those upcoming blueprints. But Brian, I'll invite you to kind of walk through and share a little bit more about those new chapters around functional design, TI exchange, verification, and tracing.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks, Connie and Matt. Appreciate your joining us all today. So I want to just give you a quick overview of chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5. 5 things you really want to know about what we're looking at from the blueprint. We're referencing existing standards, and where there aren't standards, we'll make requests to those standards organizations or entities to help build us to where we are. We've identified that. We want to define those compliance functional requirements around TI exchange, verification, tracing, and credentialing. And while doing all this, we want to ensure that we're doing it in a compliant manner, but just to recognize that the blueprint's not a legal or regulatory requirement. It's something industry has come back together saying, hey, how are we going to implement the DSCSA from our different vantage points and our different business models? That doesn't call for development or sharing of industry infrastructure. Rather, we want to build on assumptions of a distributed architecture, that it'll be a system of systems of that for developing that network. And all along, trading partners being familiar with the implementation as we move forward at that solution level. So we go to the next slide, please. Great, thanks. So the PDG functional design weaves together those existing designs along with new areas like tracing and credentialing, and it defines the PDG view that meets the compliance and business needs that were called out in Chapter 1. We refer to that PDG functional design, as Eric mentioned earlier, as the PDG defined EDDS network, or Enhanced Drug Distribution Security Network. The Chapter 2, it's meant really to onboarding the reader to all the overall PDG functional design. It assists in this endeavor by the chapter highlighting some of the key terminologies that will be used throughout the next following chapters, discusses business and system capabilities, and the relationship among the defined EDDS. It basically is setting the stage for those subsequent chapters that are going to come. So we go to the next. So Chapter 2 continues to focus on the points of interoperability between the solutions and the networks, the solutions they create. So as an example, it's highlighted, it might be a little bit small to see, but you can see there's the white boxes and then the yellow area. So, and I'll draw your attention just a second for the white boxes. So here we're talking about ATPs that decide to use a system or a network that's built out, generally developed by that same solution provider. And we'll call that an intraoperable solution. While users between boxes, they're doing multiple systems developed by different vendors, and we're calling that the interoperable solution. And that's the space, that yellow space, is where the PDG defined EDDS plays. So just to give a little bit more context, we go to the next slide, please. So Chapter 1 of the blueprint is the foundational chapters we talked about earlier. And then Chapters 3, 4, and 5 build off the PDG defined compliance requirements and business requirements for 2023 interoperability. Chapter 3 for serialization TI exchange covers those topics around TI exchange. While exchange discussed in Chapter 1 speaks to the what, such as the standard transaction information elements or maybe the expectations of TI, Chapter 3 now speaks to the functional needs or the how of the TI to be exchanged, and introduces that notion of pushing data using EPCIS files and web portals. It also talks about topics such as drop shipments, direct shipments, misalignment, and implications of the transaction information that are presented. So we'll go to the next slide, please. In the case of Chapter 4, again, we're building on that work of Chapter 1. In this chapter, we bring a new functionality to the verification using contextual questions to be added to a verification request. As some of you may recall, the original VRS, verification router service, was done part of the wholesale saleable return. So now we're giving additional context questions to ask for a verification request. It also addressed questions such as acquiring contact information from an ATP that's an indirect trading partner, where maybe there's a further conversation that needs to be warranted based upon the response of that verification request. It also speaks to the topic of possession. So when a request is made for verification, one of the requirements is that someone has the product in physical possession. And then lastly, another item it talks to is the requester is an authorized trading partner through electronic verifiable credential. We'll go to the next, and I'll speak next about Chapter 5. So here, again, we're introducing, as Eric, I think, alluded to, or Matt was alluded to earlier, that we're bringing a new topic to the forefront. That's tracing, something that's very new on this 10-year journey. In Chapter 5, the model for request and response, as well as a protocol to aid an interoperable, is addressed here. And as with the case of verification, the role of credentialing plays in the request and response for tracing is presented developing what's the protocol should look like between those two trading partners. We'll go to the next. And then finally in chapter 6 is dealing with a credentialing topic, which is the last chapter. And this addresses the how for the topic of conforming to authorized trading partner status and identity across an electronic network through the ability to authenticate and authorize each other in a DSCSA electronic interactions. And as Eric alluded to at the very beginning of the presentation, at the moment, chapter 6 hasn't been published, but we anticipate it to be published in the very near term. So Eric, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Brian, for that flyby of the various chapters. Again, we will do additional sessions on each of those chapters that Brian just noted, dig into them much more in much more depth. Encourage you to join those sessions in the coming weeks and or watch the PDG website for the recordings of those, again, to dig into much more detail around each of those chapters. So thank you to each of the panelists for being part of that conversation and being part of the dialogue here. That is the end of our formal